How's it going, everyone? It's Harvey from Weather SpongeBob 1000, and in this video, we're gonna focus on where exactly the Bermuda-Azores High could position itself this hurricane season and how it could determine the type of tracks we'll see for this hurricane season, and in turn could determine where exactly who will be the most likely to receive hurricane landfall this year, or tropical cyclone landfall in general. So let's begin by taking a look at the three types of tracks that would be associated with the Bermuda-Azores High, depending on where it's positioned. So the first track would be the best case scenario for pretty much the entirety of North America, where the Bermuda-Azores High is very weak, and we see the track go a lot further northward a lot earlier, well before it moves west enough to reach land, which would certainly be the best case scenario. Maybe it does impact Bermuda on the way, but outside of that, it misses out on the entirety of North America, which would be our more favorable track for this hurricane season if we were to see the ridge a little bit weaker and a little bit further eastward. However, there is a second track which does pose a little bit more of a risk for the United States, where we do see the Bermuda-Azores High a little bit further westward, which in turn forces tropical cyclones a little bit further westward, and the East Coast becomes more at risk. However, it still doesn't move far west enough to necessarily move as far west as the Gulf Coast, or maybe as far south as the Caribbean islands. So in this scenario, while the East Coast would be more at risk, it doesn't necessarily pose the highest threat for the Gulf of Mexico either. But if we were to move on to phase 3, this would be the worst case scenario for the Caribbean and pretty much the entirety of the United States, where far more tropical cyclones would move further westward. If we were to see the Bermuda-Azores High move a little bit further westward, this would be track 3, the worst case scenario. So we're going to take a look at several different factors to determine where exactly the ridge will form this hurricane season, which will determine who exactly will be most likely to receive more tropical cyclone landfalls this hurricane season. So I think a good place to start is taking a look at the ENSO outlook, because this definitely gives a good idea of where exactly the air pressures will be located, if we're going to see a lower air pressure over the Atlantic or we're going to see a higher air pressure in the Atlantic. A big determinant of that is the ENSO outlook, more specifically right over the ENSO 3.4 region, right over the equatorial Pacific, because the cooler the sea surface temperatures are, of course, that is a La Nina. That would promote more of a seeking motion over the Pacific, while the Atlantic experiences more of a rising motion. And since there's a strong amount of sinking air over the ENSO region during a La Nina pattern, there needs to be an equal amount of convergence and rise when it comes to the air pressure in other areas, and that typically happens in the Atlantic, which is the reason why we see more tropical cyclones in the Atlantic during a La Nina pattern. But for a neutral pattern, it's anywhere between El Nino and La Nina, so we're right in the middle when it comes to we're closer to the middle when it comes to the amount of tropical cyclones you should expect for the hurricane season. Won't necessarily be as active as a La Nina pattern, but won't necessarily be as inactive as an El Nino pattern, at least for the Atlantic hurricane season. So it should be right around the middle, while for El Nino pattern, of course, you're less likely to experience many tropical cyclones during a pattern like that. But the ENSO outlook doesn't only determine the amount of tropical cyclones that form. It could also determine where exactly these tropical cyclones move, which I'm going to show you guys right now based on the past 30 years of hurricane tracks for La Nina and El Nino patterns. So let's take a look at that right now. So here's a look at the La Nina hurricanes over the past 30 years compared to the El Nino hurricanes in the last 30 years. And we see a clear difference, not only, of course, when it comes to the amount of tropical cyclones that have developed, but exactly where these tropical cyclones move towards, because we see in a La Nina pattern, we see far more tropical cyclones move a lot further westward into the Gulf Coast. And the reason being is that during a La Nina pattern, we see less of a strong easterly or westerly flow in the upper levels. So that allows tropical cyclones to have more of a chance to move further westward without being deterred or weakened by strong westerly wind shear that would be associated with an El Nino pattern, where there's so much rising air right over the equatorial Pacific that all that air that has risen over the equatorial Pacific needs to move somewhere, needs to diverge in the upper levels, because there's just the atmosphere or basic physics just doesn't like it when there's a high amount of air pressure over one small area. So it wants to space out, it wants to diverge in the upper levels in the equatorial Pacific. And as it diverges, it creates wind in the upper levels that move towards the Atlantic, where the air pressure would more likely be lower compared to the equatorial Pacific, which creates that westerly flow that pushes a lot of tropical cyclones a little bit further eastward during an El Nino pattern, which we clearly see right here. So based on this fact alone, I do expect tropical cyclones to move a little bit further westward than average, which unfortunately poses more of a risk for the Caribbean and the United States when it comes to hurricane landfalls. Now, we're around a 50-50 chance we're going to see a La Nina pattern this hurricane season. So we very well could see a neutral pattern. So maybe it's in a little bit right in the middle when it comes to where exactly these tropical cyclones could move towards. Maybe it could be right in between what we typically see during an El Nino and a La Nina. But typically during a neutral pattern, especially when it's leaning a little bit more closer to the likelihood of a La Nina, I'm more inclined to believe tropical cyclones would move a little bit further westward this hurricane season. So we should see the Bermuda-Azores High move a little bit further westward as well, and force those tropical cyclones a little bit further westward. I don't think as far west as, let's say, the Gulf of Mexico would be more likely, but I'll say maybe closer to the east coast of the United States and the Caribbean. That's where I do believe you're more likely to receive hurricane landfalls this hurricane season relative to your average along the East Coast, because for a place like New Jersey compared to, let's say, a place like Louisiana, of course New Jersey in any hurricane season is less likely to experience a hurricane landfall or tropical cyclone landfall, but relative to their averages, I think New Jersey is more likely than Louisiana, relatively speaking. So definitely keep that in mind going into this hurricane season. Another thing that's good to take a look at is the CFS model, 3-month average when it comes to geopotential height anomalies, as this gives a good idea of where exactly we could expect higher air pressures over the Atlantic this hurricane season and where exactly the Bermuda-Azores High will be positioned. So we clearly see that the air pressure is expected to be stronger than normal for much of the northern Atlantic, including right over the area where the Bermuda-Azores High is located. So I see it less likely we're going to see tropical cyclones take tracks further eastward, well to the east of the United States and North America in general, as I do expect a stronger amount of ridging to push tropical cyclones a little bit further westward this hurricane season. Again, not so far west into the Gulf of Mexico, but I think this general area could be in for more of a likely shot of tropical cyclones moving towards this general vicinity, thanks to the stronger amount of ridging and the fact that we could see a neutral to a La Nina pattern by the time we approach this hurricane season. So I think that will contribute to tropical cyclones moving a little bit further westward. Another thing that's good to take a look at that you might not expect when it comes to predicting where exactly the Bermuda-Azores High will be located is the sea surf temperature anomalies. And you're probably wondering, why am I showing you this? Aren't the sea surf temperatures not necessarily very correlated to where the Bermuda-Azores High is located? And while it isn't exactly entirely correlated, there's still certainly some correlation between sea surf temperature anomalies and exactly how the air pressure will be over the Atlantic. Because the thing is that over the sea surf temperatures, over areas where the sea surf temperatures are cooler than normal, you're more likely to receive more of a sinking motion more than normal, because the sea surf temperatures are so cold that you won't necessarily see that same level of convergence as well as overall just lift in the atmosphere, because sea surf temperatures being cooler than average will cool down the temperature, the air temperature in general, which means that the air pressure will be a little bit more dense, and that would promote more of a sinking motion in the atmosphere. In a scenario like this, we see that the sea surf temperatures are a little bit warmer than normal. We do have pockets where it's cooler than normal, where the Bermuda-Azores High will be located. I think it's going to be very important to take a look at the sea surf temperatures anomaly over this area. Specifically, right now it seems like we're right in the mix of it, but if we do see the sea surf temperatures rise well above normal, that could weaken the Bermuda-Azores High enough to deter hurricanes from being able to move a lot further westward, which would certainly be good news, but it's still a little bit too early to say for certain. I do believe that the warmer sea surf temperatures we're seeing over this area, as well as the cooler sea surf temperatures we're seeing over the main development region, could contribute to the Bermuda-Azores High being a little bit weaker this hurricane season, since there's more of a rising motion thanks to the warmer air temperature as a result of the warmer sea surf temperatures. So I think that could contribute to the Bermuda-Azores High being a little bit weaker, which will mean that hurricanes won't move very far westward. But I do believe that it still will move far west enough to maybe pose a threat to the United States East Coast and Caribbean this hurricane season. So definitely still be aware of the sea surf temperatures over the next few months. Another thing that's good to take a look at is the analog years. And analog years are pretty much years that are very similar to the conditions we're experiencing right now. And 3 years that really stand out to me as having conditions very similar to our circumstances right now were the years of the hurricane seasons of 1996, 2001, and 2012. Those are all above average hurricane seasons. And taking a look at their exact track trajectory, based on the 3 hurricane seasons, a lot of the hurricanes tended to move just west enough to maybe pose a threat to the East Coast, but not necessarily far west enough to impact the Gulf of Mexico very much. This is a 1996 hurricane season. We see in conditions very similar to what we're experiencing right now. Hurricanes tending to pretty much hug the East Coast a lot of the time, so I think that could be very interesting to really take note of, that maybe the Bermuda-Azores High this hurricane season will be in a position where you're more likely to receive hurricane landfalls right over the East Coast, so definitely keep that in mind. The 2001 hurricane season, we see somewhat of a similar scenario. The hurricanes aren't as far westward, and thankfully many of the hurricanes stayed well to the east of North America in general. And when it comes to the Gulf of Mexico, it was pretty much very quiet out, with the exception of one tropical storm. So I do believe this could also outline the possibility that maybe hurricanes could stay far east enough at the same time to not affect most of North America. But based on the other factors I showed you, when it comes to what the CFS model is forecasting when it comes to the amount of ridging over the Atlantic, as well as the fact that we're expected to be anywhere between a neutral and La Nina phase, I still do think we're more likely to see tropical cyclones move further westward than not this hurricane season. So here's my Bermuda-Azores High forecast in general. I think that the Bermuda-Azores High will position itself just west enough to pose a threat more so right over the East Coast this hurricane season, as well as the Caribbean, but not necessarily so far west where it impacts the Gulf of Mexico. So definitely keep that in mind this hurricane season. Of course, take this with a grain of salt. It's very difficult to forecast the long-term effects of the Bermuda-Azores High, that's months away. But based on the analog years I showed you, as well as what we typically see during La Nina patterns, as well as what the CFS model is currently forecasting, I do believe we will see a stronger Bermuda-Azores High that could pose more of a threat to the United States this hurricane season. So definitely keep that in mind, and stay tuned for further updates this hurricane season on this channel. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching.